Hello, I'm Vincentius Steven, and here I will start with the introduction. Humans have unique way to communicate with each other. One of them is gestures. You can find the usage of gestures in greeting, threatening, insulting, agreeing and disagreeing, and last but not least, pointing that we will talk about in this presentation. Pointing don't have to be done with finger. Pointing also can be done with eye, lip, or chin, or any other part of the body. The function of doing pointing is to direct someone's attention to a place, to something in that place. Like in a nutshell, pointing is like if I tell you to look over there. When you look over there, you should know what I mean by telling you to look over there. Infants usually begin to point to things for other person around on 11 to 12 months of age. They use human pointing to tell that they want the adult to retrieve something for them. People are debating whether they point to only to achieve certain objective, a certain goal, or they point to communicate with other. At some point, baby point to use adult as a tool to get their external entity. Like if they want something, they treat adult like a tool. Since they are not realizing that adult is someone that they can communicate with, so at that moment they only view adult as a social tool. Next is about pointing basic. As I said earlier, pointing is used to direct people's attention to a location in the perceptual environment. Pointing itself means nothing without any context. Like when I point at something, maybe I point at a building without any context in front of you. Will you understand that what I mean? Especially if we don't really know each other, that maybe you will be confused about what am I doing. That's why pointing itself does not mean anything. In order to understand pointing, there is something called common ground. Common ground is the context that we knew each other. In order to understand common ground, we can take a look at 3 of 5 general type of speech act motif. First one is informative. Informative is the communicator want the recipient to know something that he thinks. Next is requestive. The communicator want the recipient to do something that will help him. This can be in the presentation in the slide before. I said that baby use this one to make adult grab things for him or her. Next one is expressive. The communicator want the recipient to feel some attitude or emotion that he is already feeling. That's all from me, and next will be continued by my friend.
Okay, thank you, Steven. Now we're going to move on to infant pointing. So, infant pointing is the communicative gesture that babies around 1 year old of age begin to usually use. They will begin acquiring language in that age, and when they do, they will begin pointing. And this activity, according to some evidence, it is widespread and not only applies to babies in Western culture, but babies around the globe. We will find out how much different infant pointing with its adult version of communicative gestures, like Steven has previously explained about. So to put things in the context, you can take a look at this table and pause your video for a moment. And okay, you've paused your video. Let's move on to the next slide. So according to that table of example, the baby is around 11 to 14 months old, to give you context. So as you can see from those tables, the infant, it not only pointed to objects that they want, but also the objects that is involved. For example, they wanted the window to be opened or the glass to be filled with water, thus requesting not an object but an action. They also pointed to a desired location, for example when they wanted a chair or their own bodies to be moved and to be placed in a certain place. These requests sometimes can be different. In addition, infant pointing can also be used to show a wide array of expressions. For example, when J points to the door, that indicates that his dad is preparing to leave, and then to the object that they were forbidden to touch, to the location where an object was previously found, to an object that had previously hurt them, and etc. And this is called as proto-declaratives. They do this to anticipate and remembering non-present events. As for adults, proto-declarative, it is mainly used for obtaining adults' attention to objects when they're talking to each other. And then, as I said before about joint intentional frame, or we can call it common ground. Common ground in infants' comprehension of communicative acts is very important. Through common ground, infants can interact in the same context with the adult they interacted with, because they have shared an experience with the adult. So, common ground is the basic ingredient to shape human-style cooperative communication. Now, for the next part, it will be explained by Angger.
The next part is about reference in infant pointing. Infants by the age of 12 to 14 months old demonstrate an understanding of the act of referencing as the act of intentionally inducing others to attend to some particular external entity, even an absent entity, as a part of some larger communicative act occurring within some joint attentional common ground. This process involves much more than simply case following or point following or gaining attention to the infant themselves, but it involves a communicator's intention, which is the infant, to direct a recipient's attention to a particular referent through some relation to their common ground, and it will make the needed relevant inferences and so comprehend the communicator's overall social intention. And basically, it is more about the infant attempting to get an emotional reaction from the recipient instead of trying to refer to the external entity. As mentioned before, infant pointing is to invite the recipient to attend to some referent, but this also happens for a reason. The communicator has some larger social intention, and infant pointing establishes three general classes of social intention or motive. These classes are: first, infants want others to feel things, an expressive declarative motive for wanting to share emotions and attitudes about things. For example, when an infant points to something to an adult, they expect the adult to also be enthusiastic about what the infant is pointing. Second, they want others to know things. This is the informative declarative motive for wanting to help others by providing them with needed or desirable information. For example, when an adult is looking for a particular object, the infant points at the object with the intention of simply helping the adult without wanting to share emotions or attitudes about the object. And third, they want others to do things. This is the imperative or requestive motive for asking others to help them in attaining goals, and this can happen either individualistic or cooperative. For example, an infant may point to a toy in expecting an adult would go get it and give it to.
Now, I would like to talk about infant pointing and communicative intention behind infant pointing. So before I begin, I would like to question you whether children comprehend and produce their early pointing gestures with the full adult-like schema. This is the schema. She intends that I attend to X and wants us to know this together for some common ground. Because, as we already know, it's not really clear whether infants operate with the and wants us to know this together part of the schema, because this kind of action requires many other following things such as politeness, manners, etc. etc. However, in the discussion that I will share after this, there is a possibility that they use some kind of primordial communicative intention that contains the basic structures, but not all of the adult details. So at least they understand the basic structures of this communicative intention. And I will show you the evidence after this. So here are the evidence. And first of all, we got from around the first birthday, infants clearly produce communicative acts for another person or understand that such act was for them. So they make sure that they have the attention of the other and direct the act to them, make eye contacts and so forth. So at least they understand that this act was for them. And yes, and the second one is when adult directed her extended index finger to one of the buckets as she distractedly examined wrist. The 14-month-old infants did not see this as a communicative act for them, and so they did not make the appropriate relevance inference. It means that they did not see it as informing them of the location of the hidden toy or anything. They don't really understand what the researcher doing in here, so they don't really understand what she meant by pointing at a bucket, because there's no toy or anything in there, so they don't really give an appropriate relevant inference. Next in here, we got the third one. Infants sometimes pointed even though the adult was already attending to the target referent, as if they want the adult to not only attend the object but also know what they want to talk or communicate about this object. Basically, they begin to somehow understand that I don't really want you to only attend the object, but I also want you to talk about the object. I also want to communicate to you about the object. Basically, something like that. And the fourth one is children at 30 months of age corrected adult misunderstandings. It means that in this age, children, they begin to understand, they have the communicative intention in which they can communicate successfully with the adult. Basically, we can say that in their first and second year, infants comprehend a primordial version of communicative intention in which they understand when a communicator intends to act for someone else's benefits and intends that both she and the recipient know this together. Basically, they at least know the basic structure of communicative intention, but to understand it like a full adult-like schema, the structure of adult-like communicative intention, they need to be around 3 or 4 years of age to understand it fully. So this is the summary of infant pointing, and you may pause this video to read all of it because I won't read it for you. Thank you. Now we will talk about the role of shared intentionally. So in here we will talk about ontogeny and phylogeny, if I'm not pronouncing it wrong. I hope so. So infants understand and produce their pointing gestures at around 12 months of age and surprisingly adult-like. So the question is now, where do these communicative skills come from ontogenetically and phylogenetically? Well, that's the question. Now we'll begin with ontogeny. It's basically the study of the development of an organism. It can be human, animals, and many other things. I don't know. And it happens both physically and psychologically. So it can be moral development or your body development, things like that. And it begins usually from the time of fertilization of the egg to adult. And in here, we will learn when some skills or specific competence emerge in infants. Like the one we already talked about is infant pointing. And yeah, we will talk about it in this chapter. So as we already know, infants starts pointing at 3 months of age. However, they are not using it for communicative functions, even though they seem to have the need to use it for communicative functions. For example, they need the adults to do things for them, like fetching things and stuff like that. But they do not use this pointing, these gestures for communicative functions. And they only learn this for communicative functions at 12 months of age. So you might be wondering, why do infants not learn to use pointing for social functions at 3 to 6 months of age, but only at 12 months of age? Well, the answer is pretty simple. It's because 3 to 6 months old infants actually do not really understand the formula. This is a formula. She intends that I attend to eggs and wants us to know this together, and for some reason relevant to our common ground. Like we've already been discussing before, they only understand the basic formula, so they don't really understand every inch of this formula. That's why it's hard for them to use pointing for social functions. But at 12 months of age, they begin to understand it, and that's why they use pointing to somehow communicate with the adults. And yeah, that's the answer. And based on the best available evidence, here is when some key prerequisite social cognitive skills emerge. And next, here is the summary. So infants around 12 months of age understand first something about choices people make in actions and perceptions, which means their intention and attention, and then something about why people make these choices and in terms of some higher grading goals and also possible constraints, and the third, what knowledge they do and do not share with others based on what they have experienced together with them in joint attentional interactions. And last but not least, the basic operative motives. So our overall argument is that the skills that really make a difference here are those of shared intentionality, although of course, skills of individual intentionality are necessary as well. However, it's still hard to specify whether the emergence of infants' communicative pointing at around 1 year of age is due to emerging skills of individual or shared intentionality, as both emerge together. But we can still discuss it in the next study, which is phylogeny by Gwynna.
So now we're going to talk about phylogeny. In their natural communication, humans' closest primate relatives or any other animal species do not point for one another. However, chimpanzees and other apes growing up in human captivity do learn to point to out of reach food or other things they desire so that a human will retrieve it for them. Approximately 60 until 70% of all captive chimpanzees engage in this behavior spontaneously with no training from human when presented with the appropriate situation. Levens, Russells, and Hopkins have documented that this pointing behavior is used quite flexibly. For example, chimpanzees will point out to the most desirable food, but when being given other less desirable food, because that's not what they want, they will persistently point out to that most desirable food. The other one is that when some human race apes observe that when a human hiding food from them, they will point out to the place where the human hide the food to the other human so that the other human will retrieve it for them. And when that other human needs a tool to be able to retrieve the food, the apes will point out to the place of the tool. Apes pointing doesn't serve functions other than the imperative or requesting functions. Thus, it is possible that ape pointing for human relies on somewhat different social cognitive and social motivational skills than does human pointing. One possible indication of this is that apes are not very skillful at comprehending informative pointing gesture. If a human points and looks towards some food that the apes does not see, and by following the points and looks of the human, the apes will go get it. In this sense, we can conclude that apes understand the human's point as an attention direct. But in an object choice experiment in which a human attempts to help the ape locate the hidden food by pointing to its location, apes generally perform quite poorly. In general, very few apes understand the pointing gesture in this context spontaneously. It is certainly interesting that some domesticated animal species like human-trained dolphins are reasonably skillful in this object choice task. The explanation to this case is still unclear, but the possibility is that they understand the pointing not as the informative, but rather as a command to go to a location. Task failures may be explained in an almost infinite number of ways. So Hare and Tomasello conducted a competitive version of object choice tasks in which instead of pointing, a human reached toward the correct bucket but unable to grasp it. Now, as the chimpanzees understand where the food is, they were able to infer that the humans wants to get the bucket for herself. Therefore, there must be something good in there. But they were unable to infer that the human wants the chimpanzees to get the bucket for some reasons relevant to their common ground, to the common ground of both of them. From this, we can understand that even though the superficial behavior of human was highly similar in the two versions of this task, in which the arm extension, apes' understanding of humans' behavior was very different, presumably because the human was expressing an individual intention, not a communicative intention. So, what are we to make of the apes' behavior in these studies? One plausible interpretation is that human infants find the object choice tasks trivially easy because 1. They have created with the adult a shared goal of searching for hidden object, which creates a joint attentional frame of things relevant to that shared goal, which is a shared space of possible reference and messages. And second, child and adult mutually assume that the adult is trying to be cooperative. But apes typically do not know what the human is attempting to communicate in this situation because 1. They have not created with the human any kind of joint goal or joint attentional frame of things relevant to a shared activity, and second, they do not share with the human the mutual assumption of partner cooperativeness. This means that the apes do not, indeed cannot, make the appropriate relevant inferences because they are missing the basic premise that the communicator is attempting to inform them cooperatively of something in their common ground, even though they can make other inferences about what a human competitor is doing in a goal-directed act. And so, apes simply do not understand why the human is pointing to the bucket. Even if the communicative intention is overly expressed, the gesture is an inexplicable and irrelevant act. So it's like the ape is searching for the food individually, and so the ape follows the human points to the bucket. But then the ape says to herself, like, it's a bucket, so what? Now where's the food? The bucket is not relevant for the ape, and it has not occurred to the ape that the human might be pointing to inform the ape of things the human thinks the ape will find relevant. Apes' understanding of other goals and perceptions support both the production and comprehensions of some forms of imperative pointing, but not motivated to simply share information and attitudes with others, nor do they comprehend when others attempt to communicate these motives. This means that apes' communication, both with one another and with human, is more individualistic, whereas human communication is more cooperative in the sense that it is all about helping and sharing within the context of various kinds of common conceptual ground with other persons. Without such shared intentionality, human-like cooperative communication is simply not possible. And now we're going to talk about the last topic, into language. Also relevant for characterizing the nature of infant pointing is to its relation to the other form of communication that follow it, ontogenically, specifically linguistic conventions. They believe that children's initial skills with a conventional language emerge to the heels of their initial skills with pointing paving the way, typically by only a couple of months because both of these forms of infant communications are learned and used within the same interpersonal nexus of shared intentionality. So, the comprehensions and use of linguistic symbol in flexible and communicatively appropriate ways depends on infants' understanding of others as intentional agents with whom one can share experience. And so, to the degree that infants' gestural communication resembles their linguistic communication. Brunner argued and provided evidence intentionality that children's comprehension and learning of language is scaffolded by joint attentional performance, in which both the child and the adult have a common understanding of some delimited domain of experience. The explanation for this finding is simply that to comprehend an act of linguistic reference, the communicator and recipient must connect the linguistic act to some form of common ground, just as the case of pointing. Thus, hearing a novel word gavagai, the infant must find some way to establish joint attention with the speaker on a relevant by connecting to the common ground in the very same way that they do this in comprehending a pointing gesture. In most cases, pointing presupposes the joint attentional common ground as topic or as old or shared information, and the pointing act is actually predication or focus informing the recipient of something new worthy of their attention. In other cases, pointing serves to establish a new topic about which further things may then be communicated. These are two main functions served by whole utterances in linguistic communication, what Lamberach calls predicate focus and sentence focus contractions. Also, when infants first begin talking, many of their earliest utterances are communications of gestures, well, mostly pointing, with words dividing up in various ways of topic and focus functions. Language, of course, goes well beyond pointing and other deictic gesture, in the ease of which linguistic symbols may be grammaticalized into constructions with complex topic focus configurations. But the key point in the current context is simply that the topic focus building blocks are basically the same in two cases. The cooperative motives for communicating linguistically and via pointing are basically the same as well, informing, requesting, and sharing attitudes. Language is, of course, very different from pointing structurally, as a language is a historically evolved inventory as of symbol devices for directing others' attention perspectively in myriad ways. Is directing attention in one way rather than the other ways that are possible in symbolic inventory. Linguistic reference thus goes well beyond what it is possible to indicate explicitly by simply indexically directing someone's attention to a location. Additionally, although reference to entities displaced in space and/or time has traditionally been held to the exclusive province of language, and there is no doubt that language does this by far most productively. Within the appropriate joint attentional frame, even 1-year-old infants may point to indicate something about non-present entities. The study argues that the most fundamental aspect of language that make it such a uniquely powerful form of human cognition and communicative joint attention reference via perspectives, reference to absent entities, cooperative motives to help and to share, and other embodiments of shared intentionality are already present in the humble act of infant pointing.